The heavy oak door slammed shut with a sickening thud echoing through the freezing Atlanta night. I stood there ankle-deep in snow, the metallic taste of blood pooling in my mouth as I clutched my stinging cheek. My other hand gripped the freezing metal handles of my 82-year-old grandfather's wheelchair. We had just been violently thrown out of my parents' multi-million-dollar estate on Christmas Eve. They thought they had finally discarded the dead weight. They thought we had nothing left. What they did not know was that the shivering old man sitting beside me held a secret that was about to strip them of every dime, every property, and every ounce of their precious high society status. My name is Chloe. I am 35 years old and I have spent my entire life as the designated scapegoat of my family. Before I tell you how a freezing Christmas Eve turned into the most satisfying billionaire revenge story you will ever hear, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you believe that blood does not make you family, loyalty does. 45 minutes before I found myself bleeding in the snow, I was standing on the pristine front porch of my parents' sprawling mansion in Buckhead. My parents, Vivian and Reginald, built their entire existence around projecting an image of flawless black excellence. Their sprawling estate with its towering columns and perfectly manicured winter landscaping was a fortress designed to impress their country club friends. I had spent years working hard as a financial auditor, building a solid, independent life for myself, but every time I walked up those steps, I was instantly reduced to the disappointing daughter. I adjusted the thick lap blanket over Grandpa Jeremiah's legs. He sat quietly in his wheelchair, his sharp eyes taking in the grand facade with a silent, knowing look that I rarely understood back then. I took a deep breath, pasted on a polite holiday smile, and pushed his chair through the grand double doors. The house smelled of expensive catering and cinnamon, but the atmosphere turned ice cold the moment we crossed the threshold. My mother, Vivian, intercepted us before we could even take off our coats. She wore a tailored crimson evening gown and diamonds that probably cost more than my car. Instead of a warm greeting or a simple Merry Christmas, her eyes immediately darted up and down my appearance, her face twisting in pure disdain. "You actually wore your hair like that?" She hissed, her voice a harsh whisper, designed not to carry into the formal living room. She reached out and flicked a strand of my natural coils with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "And that coat, Chloe. I told you to buy something that does not look like it came off a clearance rack. Jada and Connor are in the parlor, and Connor's parents might video call us later. I will not have you looking like a charity case in front of my sophisticated son-in-law." I bit the inside of my cheek, refusing to let her ruin the night before it even started. I worked 70 hours a week tracking corporate financial fraud, bringing down corrupt executives. Yet to my mother, my value was entirely dependent on whether my appearance validated her social climbing. "It is freezing outside, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "The coat keeps me warm, and my hair is fine. Merry Christmas to you, too." Grandpa Jeremiah chuckled softly from his wheelchair, a low, rumbling sound that earned him a furious glare from Vivian. "And you?" she snapped, pointing a diamond-ringed finger at the man who had raised her husband. "Make sure you keep those dirty wheels off my imported Brazilian hardwood. Reginald just had it polished for the holidays and Connor hates seeing scuff marks." She did not offer to take his coat. She did not offer him a warm drink from the cold. She simply spun on her expensive heels and marched back toward the sound of clinking champagne glasses and manufactured laughter. I knelt down to unbutton Grandpa Jeremiah's heavy winter jacket, my hands shaking slightly from the blatant disrespect. He patted my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong for an 82-year-old man. "Let them talk, Chloe," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a strange shiver down my spine. "Pride comes before the fall, and they are standing on a very tall cliff." I thought he was just offering comforting grandfatherly wisdom. I had absolutely no idea how literal his words were about to become, or that the real nightmare of this Christmas dinner had not even begun. The dining room looked like a spread from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the massive chandelier overhead. A ridiculous mountain of catered food sat untouched in the center of the sprawling mahogany table. Jada and Connor were already seated. My sister was draped in a silk designer dress, casually scrolling through her phone. Beside her sat Connor, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He wore a tailored suit paid for by my parents. His smug posture radiated the unearned arrogance of a man who had not punched a time clock in over 3 years. I maneuvered Grandpa Jeremiah's wheelchair toward the empty space at the far end of the table. The rubber wheels made a faint, soft squeak against the floorboards. It was barely noticeable, but in this house, any excuse to attack was quickly weaponized. Connor stopped swirling his bourbon. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and pointed a finger toward the floor. Do we really have to drag that metal contraption back and forth across the Brazilian cherry wood? He looked at Jada, acting as if Grandpa and I were hired help. I just told the housekeeping staff to polish those floors yesterday. The rubber is leaving scuff marks everywhere. It is completely disrespectful to the property. Jada immediately nodded in agreement. She did not even look up from her phone screen. Connor is right, Chloe. You could at least try to lift the chair over the thresholds. These floors cost more than your salary. My jaw tightened. I locked the brakes on the wheelchair and took my seat next to Grandpa. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of absolute calm. I wanted to scream, but the heavy footsteps of my father entering the room forced me to bite my tongue. Reginald strode in. He adjusted his custom tie, projecting the image of a powerful patriarch. He took his position at the head of the table. Vivian flanked him, still shooting me venomous glances from her side of the table. Reginald did not greet his father. He did not ask Grandpa how he was feeling today. Instead, he looked directly at Connor with a warm, accommodating smile, a smile he never directed at his own blood. I am glad you brought that up, Connor, my father said smoothly. He unfolded his linen napkin and draped it over his lap. I have actually been meaning to discuss a more permanent solution regarding the living arrangements. The wheelchair is becoming a liability to the property value, and frankly, the medical equipment is cluttering up the estate. I froze. My fork hovered halfway to my plate. What exactly are you saying, Dad? Reginald completely ignored me. He kept his attention focused entirely on his son-in-law. Connor, I know you have been needing more space for your cryptocurrency trading setups. That small study you are using right now is simply inadequate for a man of your business acumen. Connor puffed out his chest. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his so-called business acumen had drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from my parents' bank accounts. It has been a bit cramped, Reginald. The multi-monitor setup requires proper ventilation. I am expecting to scale operations by the next quarter, and I need proper square footage. My mother chimed in. She practically beamed at the failed investor. We want you to be comfortable, Connor. Your success is our success. Which is why Reginald and I have been researching state care facilities. The words hit me like a physical blow. State care facilities. I looked from Vivian to Reginald. You want to put your own father in a low-income nursing home, I demanded. My voice rose above the polite clinking of silverware. He raised you, he paid for your first house, and now you want to dump him in a state-run facility so Connor can have a trading room for fake internet money. Keep your voice down in my house, Reginald snapped. His friendly demeanor vanished instantly as he glared at me. It is a practical decision. The state facilities are perfectly adequate for someone in his financial condition. He just sits around all day anyway. It makes absolutely no sense to dedicate the entire East Guest Wing to one old man when Connor needs a home office to build his enterprise. I looked at Grandpa Jeremiah. He was slowly cutting a piece of roast beef. He was completely silent. He chewed his food as if he were watching a poorly acted play. He did not look angry. He looked observant. He was cataloging every single word they said. But I was not capable of that kind of cold detachment. My blood was boiling. As a financial auditor, I spent my days dissecting financial truths. I ripped away corporate facades to expose the rot underneath. Sitting at this table, looking at the sheer audacity of my parents discarding a patriarch to coddle a parasite, the hypocrisy became too heavy to hold. I gripped the edge of the mahogany table. My knuckles turned white as I prepared to tear their entire financial illusion to shreds. Jada let out a dramatic sigh and finally set her phone face down on the table. She reached for her crystal water goblet, looking at me with pure condescension. "Honestly, Chloe, you are making this a bigger deal than it needs to be," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It is not just about the floor scuffs or the guest wing. It is about the financial reality of the situation. Grandpa's medical needs are completely draining the family trust. The private nurses, the specialty wheelchair, the daily insulin shipments. It is suffocating our finances. Connor and I cannot even finalize the budget for our vow renewal ceremony because so much capital is tied up in elder care." I stared at my sister. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that Reginald had bought her for her birthday. Her husband sat next to her, nodding solemnly, as if he actually contributed a single dime to the household. The sheer audacity of her statement settled over me like a heavy weight. "Draining the family trust," I repeated. I let the words hang in the dining room. I looked directly at my father. "Is that the narrative we are going with tonight, Dad? That Grandpa's insulin is the reason you had to downgrade your country club membership to the basic package last month?" Vivian slammed her fork onto her porcelain plate. "Chloe, that is entirely inappropriate." "No, what is inappropriate is sitting at a dinner table listening to a man who has not held a legitimate job in 36 months complain about a retired man taking up space," I snapped. I turned my attention fully to Connor. The smug expression on his face began to waver as my auditor instincts kicked into overdrive. I did not just look at spreadsheets for a living. I memorized them. I hunted down discrepancies, and this entire room was one massive accounting error. "Let us talk about the family trust, Jada," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Because as a certified financial auditor, I have a very particular set of skills when it comes to tracking missing capital. Grandpa's medical expenses account for exactly 4% of Reginald and Vivian's annual expenditures. Do you want to know what accounts for 38%? Connor shifted in his chair. He adjusted his collar, suddenly looking very warm under the crystal chandelier. "This is not the time or place for a financial review, Chloe." "Oh, I think it is the perfect time," I fired back. I leaned across the mahogany table, making sure he could not look away. 38% of this family's outgoing cash flow over the last 2 years has gone directly into Connor's crypto portfolios. Portfolios that have plummeted by 80% since he bought the peak of the market. You are not building an enterprise, Connor. You are gambling with my parents' retirement funds. You talk about blockchain and decentralized finance to confuse a man in his 60s, so he keeps signing checks to cover your margin calls." Reginald's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The vein in his forehead pulsed. "That is highly classified family business, Chloe. You have no right to speak on matters you do not understand." "I understand math, Dad," I replied, refusing to back down. "I understand that you took out a second mortgage on this estate 6 months ago to cover the losses on Connor's failed tech investments. I understand that Jadis Lifestyle is entirely funded by your credit lines. You are sitting here talking about dumping your own father into a state-run facility to save a few $1,000s a month while you hemorrhage hundreds of thousands keeping up the facade of a wealthy son-in-law to parade in front of your friends." Jada gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Connor is an entrepreneur. He is waiting for the market to rebound. You are just jealous because you are single and miserable and do not have a husband to provide for you." "Provide for you?" I laughed. The sound was harsh and bitter. "He does not provide for you, Jada. Reginald provides for him. Connor is a parasite. He has convinced our parents to finance his delusions of grandeur while looking down his nose at the very man whose hard work originally built this family's foundation." I pointed at Grandpa Jeremiah. "This man worked his entire life. He faced barriers you cannot even imagine. He sacrificed so you could go to elite private schools, Dad. And now you sit here in a tailored suit, paid for by debt, letting a failed crypto bro dictate who gets to live in this house. You trade away your own blood to protect an illusion." Vivian stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I will not tolerate this jealousy and disrespect. You have always been bitter, Chloe. always trying to tear down your sister's happiness just because you could never measure up to her grace. I am not tearing down anything, I said, my voice echoing in the large dining room. I am holding up a mirror. You are kicking out an 82-year-old man to make room for a con artist, and you are doing it on Christmas. Connor stood up next, throwing his linen napkin onto the table. His face was red with fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. You listen to me, you arrogant, bitter woman. I bring value to this family. I bring vision, something a glorified number cruncher like you could never understand. Connor did not stop there. The heat of the argument had emboldened him. He turned his arrogant gaze away from me and looked down at Grandpa Jeremiah. My grandfather was still sitting quietly in his wheelchair. He was watching the chaos unfold with that same unreadable calm. That silence seemed to infuriate Connor even more. It was as if he expected the old man to cower or apologize for existing. Vision requires capital, Connor spat out, waving his hand toward Grandpa. And right now, our capital is tied up, keeping a literal freeloader comfortable. Look at him, Chloe. He contributes absolutely nothing to this household. He just sits there soaking up resources we could be using to generate real wealth. He is a burden. A medical expense taking up a bedroom that could be utilized for actual business development. The air in the room vanished. The sheer disrespect of a man who had married into this family just a few years ago, speaking down to its patriarch, was entirely unacceptable. The absolute audacity of a white man standing in a black home calling the elder who had built their foundation a freeloader shattered the last shred of my composure. I stood up so fast my chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. I slammed both of my hands down flat onto the mahogany dining table. The impact rattled the crystal goblets and sent a shockwave through the fine china. Do not ever speak to him that way, I roared. My voice bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. You do not have the right to even look at him. This man worked double shifts at the shipping yards for 40 years so my father could go to college. He broke his back building the very foundation that allows you to sit here in your tailored suit and pretend you are important. He is the reason my father had the capital to start his own firm in the first place. You are nothing but a leech draining the life out of his legacy. I turned my fury toward my father. And you, Dad, you sit there and let this parasite insult your own father. You let him talk about tossing the man who raised you into a state facility like he is garbage. You are pathetic. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. I watched the realization of my words wash over Reginald. I had struck the ultimate nerve. I had exposed his financial ruin, and I had challenged his authority in front of the very son-in-law he was desperately trying to impress. His pristine image of absolute control was crumbling. Reginald did not yell, he did not argue, he simply moved. He lunged across the corner of the dining table with a speed I did not know he still possessed. Before I could process the sudden motion or raise my arms to defend myself, his open palm struck the side of my face with terrifying force. The slap was brutal. The sharp, cracking sound echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. The impact snapped my head to the side and threw me off balance. I stumbled backward, my hip colliding hard with the edge of the sideboard. A sharp ringing pierced my left ear. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. I caught myself against the wall, my hand flying up to cover my burning face. The physical pain was sharp, but the shock was entirely paralyzing. My father had never struck me in my entire adult life. I looked up, breathing heavily, expecting to see some form of horror or regret in the room. I looked at my mother. I expected a gasp. I expected Vivian to rush forward and intervene. Vivian did not gasp. She did not flinch. She did not even look at me. Instead, my mother calmly reached across the table. She picked up a folded white linen napkin and extended her arm. She handed the napkin directly to my father. It was a silent gesture telling him to wipe his hand. It was the coldest, most inhuman response I had ever witnessed. It confirmed exactly what I had always known. To them, I was not a daughter. I was an infection they were trying to cure. Reginald took the napkin. He dabbed at his palm, his chest heaving as he stared me down. His eyes were completely devoid of any paternal warmth. They were pitch black with rage. "You will not disrespect my son-in-law in my house," Reginald hissed. Every word dripped with absolute venom. "You will not come into my dining room, eat my food, and insult the man who is trying to elevate this family to the next tier of society. You are a bitter, jealous woman who brings nothing but conflict to our table." Jada sat perfectly still, watching me with a satisfied smirk. Connor adjusted his suit jacket, puffing his chest out again now that the patriarch had violently defended his honor. They had closed ranks. The illusion had been protected through sheer force. I lowered my hand from my cheek. The skin was radiating heat. I looked at the four of them standing united in their delusion. Then I looked down at Grandpa Jeremiah. He was no longer eating. His hands were resting on the armrests of his wheelchair. He was looking directly at me, and he gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent command to hold my ground. Reginald caught that silent exchange between my grandfather and me. If my words had bruised his ego, Grandpa Jeremiah's refusal to cower absolutely shattered his remaining restraint. My father did not say another word to me. He turned his back, his heavy footsteps thudding against the Brazilian hardwood as he marched directly toward the head of the table. He grabbed the rubber handles of the wheelchair with such violent force that the metal frame groaned. Grandpa Jeremiah jerked backward as Reginald ripped the chair away from the table. The plate of roast beef shattered on the floor, sending porcelain shards scattering across the dining room. "What are you doing?" I screamed, pushing myself off the wall. My cheek throbbed with a blinding heat, but the adrenaline masked the pain. "Stop it. You are going to hurt him." "He has overstayed his welcome," Reginald growled. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. His designer dress shoes crushed the broken porcelain as he forcefully spun the wheelchair around. He began shoving Grandpa toward the grand foyer. The wheels skidded and locked against the polished wood, but Reginald just pushed harder, treating his own father like a broken piece of furniture he was rushing to the curb. I scrambled after them, my heels slipping on the floor. Panic clawed at my throat. It was Christmas Eve. The temperature outside had plunged well below freezing, and a brutal mix of sleet and snow was aggressively pounding against the estate windows. Grandpa Jeremiah was in his 80s. He was wearing nothing but a thin holiday sweater and slacks. Throwing him out into a winter storm was not just cruel, it was dangerous. "Dad, stop!" I yelled, darting past the massive sweeping staircase to cut him off. "You cannot put him out there. It is freezing. He will freeze to death." Reginald did not even break his stride. He shoved the wheelchair forward with a brutal thrust, forcing me to jump out of the way or get run over. He reached the heavy double oak doors of the entryway and yanked them open. A violent gust of freezing wind howled into the foyer, bringing with it a spray of icy rain that bit into my bare arms. Jada and Connor had followed us from the dining room. They stood safely near the archway, holding their crystal goblets, watching the spectacle with perverse fascination. Neither of them made a single move to intervene. I sprinted to the hall closet, frantically tearing through the hangers. I grabbed Grandpa's heavy wool winter coat and my own modest jacket. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep my grip on the fabric. I rushed back to the open doorway, just as Reginald shoved the wheelchair over the marble threshold and out onto the snow-covered concrete porch. I ran out into the biting cold, immediately draping the thick wool coat over Grandpa's shoulders. The sleet felt like needles against the raw skin of my slapped cheek. I quickly tucked the blanket tight around his legs, my breath forming rapid white clouds in the freezing air. When I turned back toward the warmth of the foyer, Vivian was standing in the doorway. She held my leather purse in her right hand. Her face was completely devoid of maternal affection. She looked at me with the cold, calculating gaze of a socialite eradicating a pest. "Mom, please," I gasped. The frigid air was already burning my lungs. I reached a hand out toward the threshold. "You cannot do this. We have nowhere to go." Vivian lifted her arm and tossed my purse directly into the snowbank beside the porch steps. It landed with a dull thud, the leather instantly darkening as the icy slush soaked into it. "Take this dead weight and do not ever come back," Vivian sneered. Her voice cut through the howling wind with absolute precision. "You wanted to defend him so badly, now he is your problem. You are both cut off. Do not call us. Do not try to come back. You are no longer part of this family." Before I could even process the absolute finality of her words, Reginald stepped forward. He reached for the heavy brass handle of the oak door. He looked down at his father sitting in the freezing sleet, and then he looked at me. There was no hesitation. There was no regret. He pulled the door shut. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. A second later, the metallic slide of the deadbolt locking clicked into place. The sound was sharp and unforgiving. The porch lights clicked off, plunging us into the harsh gray darkness of the winter storm. I stood frozen on this concrete porch. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my face and seeped through my thin clothes. The blood from the inside of my cheek mixed with the icy precipitation dripping slowly down my chin. The sprawling Atlanta estate, the house I had visited for every major holiday, was completely sealed off. I looked down at Grandpa Jeremiah. The sleet was accumulating on his shoulders. He pulled his wool coat tighter around his chest. He did not look at the locked door. He looked up at me, his breath visible in the freezing night, waiting for my next move. I gripped the icy rubber handles of the wheelchair. My bare fingers were already going numb, but the adrenaline surging through my veins masked the cold. I turned the chair around, pointing us down the long, sweeping driveway of my parents' estate. Behind us, the massive wrought iron gates began to swing shut automatically. The mechanical hum of the motors sounded like a final judgment. We were entirely cast out. I pushed forward, leaning my entire body weight into the chair. The sleet was coming down harder now, freezing the moment it touched the asphalt and turning the steep driveway into a treacherous sheet of black ice. My boots slipped with every step, but I dug my heels in, refusing to let the wheelchair slide backward. Atlanta winters were rarely this brutal, but tonight the wind howled through the towering pine trees, biting through my thin jacket like shattered glass. I looked down at Grandpa Jeremiah. He had the thick wool coat pulled tightly around his neck, but I could see his shoulders trembling. His silence terrified me. I needed to get him to safety. I needed to get him warm. We hit the main road, and the reality of our situation crashed over me. Buckhead is not a neighborhood designed for pedestrians, let alone a woman pushing a wheelchair through a winter storm. There were no sidewalks here, only wide, dark streets flanked by massive hedges and security cameras. I pushed him along the shoulder of the road, keeping as close to the grass as possible, while cars occasionally sped past, splashing freezing slush against my legs. Every muscle in my back burned. The wheels of the chair fought against the accumulating snow, snagging on hidden rocks and ice patches. I counted our progress in streetlights, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. 1 block, 2 blocks. My lungs burned with the frigid air. The metallic taste of blood was still sharp on my tongue from where my father had slapped me. Finally, through the blinding sleet, I saw it. A flickering neon sign cutting a red glow through the gray night. A 24-hour diner. It was a local staple that sat right on the commercial edge of the wealthy residential district. I pushed the chair with a renewed burst of desperate energy. We reached the parking lot, navigated the curb, and I shoved the heavy glass door open. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, completely at odds with the nightmare we were living. A wave of glorious artificial heat hit us instantly. The diner smelled like stale coffee and fried potatoes. It was nearly empty save for a tired waitress wiping down the counter and a truck driver asleep in a corner booth. I pushed Grandpa toward a wide booth in the back, far away from the windows. I locked the brakes on his chair and stripped off my soaked jacket. Before I could even ask the waitress for a menu, my phone vibrated in my damp pocket. I pulled it out, my frozen fingers fumbling with the screen. A sharp red notification banner lit up the display. It was an urgent alert from my bank. I tapped the notification, my heart hammering against my ribs. The screen loaded and the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. The joint emergency savings account, the specific fund I had set up and managed solely to pay for Grandpa's private nurses and daily insulin shipments, was frozen. The available balance read 0. I frantically refreshed the banking application. Another notification popped up. Account locked by primary authorized signer. Reginald. My father had not just thrown us into a blizzard. He had immediately called his private wealth manager the second the door closed to sever my access to the medical funds. As a financial auditor, I kept my personal accounts meticulously separated, but the medical trust was tied to the family estate for tax purposes. Reginald knew that. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was cutting off the lifeblood that kept his own father alive. He wanted to make sure we were completely stranded. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone until the numbers blurred together. Panic, thick and suffocating, rose in my chest. I quickly unzipped my soaked leather purse, the one Vivian had callously tossed into the snowbank. I dug past my waterlogged makeup bag and pulled out my wallet. I had my personal debit card, but I knew Reginald had deep connections with the regional banking executives. If he had frozen the medical trust, he might have already initiated a freeze on my payroll accounts under the guise of suspicious activity, knowing it would take me days to untangle the bureaucratic mess over a holiday weekend. I opened the cash compartment of my wallet. I had exactly one $50 bill and a few crumpled singles. That was it. That was all the liquid capital I had to keep an 82-year-old man alive on Christmas Eve. The waitress walked over carrying 2 laminated menus and a pot of steaming coffee. She took one look at my bruised, bleeding cheek and my grandfather's shivering frame, and her customer service smile vanished. She did not ask questions. She just poured 2 mugs of coffee and pushed them toward us. "What can I get for you, honey?" she asked gently. "Just 2 bowls of your hottest chicken noodle soup, please," I replied. My voice cracked on the words. "And a glass of warm water." She nodded and hurried back to the kitchen. I wrapped my freezing hands around the ceramic coffee mug, trying to siphon the heat into my bones. I pulled out my phone again and quickly searched for nearby accommodations. There was a cheap roadside motel about half a mile down the highway. I navigated to their booking page. The cheapest room was $40 for the night. I selected the room, opted for the pay-at-counter option to preserve my last bit of cash, and confirmed the reservation. We had a roof for tonight, but tomorrow we had nothing. The waitress returned with 2 massive steaming bowls of soup and a basket of saltine crackers. She set them down gently and walked away to give us privacy. I unwrapped a plastic spoon and placed it in Grandpa's trembling hand. He looked down at the broth, the steam rising to warm his weathered face. I watched him slowly take a sip, and the dam inside me finally broke. The adrenaline that had carried me through the snowstorm completely evaporated, leaving behind a crushing, agonizing despair. I buried my face in my hands, resting my elbows on the sticky diner table, and I began to sob. The tears were hot and relentless. They stung the raw, swollen skin of my cheek where my father had struck me. My chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths that I could not control. "I am so sorry, Grandpa." I choked out the words muffled behind my hands. "I am so sorry." I lifted my head, wiping the tears that continued to stream down my face. I looked at the man who had worked his entire life to build a legacy, only to be discarded like garbage by the son he had raised. "I failed you," I cried, my voice trembling with absolute defeat. "I tried to defend you, but I made it worse. I lost my temper and now we have nothing." Reginald froze the medical accounts. "I cannot afford your insulin for next week. I cannot afford the private nurse. I only have $50 left. I booked us a terrible motel room down the highway, but after tonight we are officially homeless. It is Christmas and we are homeless." I was completely spiraling. The reality of the situation was a massive, terrifying mountain that I had no equipment to climb. I had spent my entire adult life planning, auditing, predicting financial outcomes, and securing safety nets. Yet in one violent hour, my parents had stripped away every single layer of security I had built for this man. I felt entirely broken. I felt like a worthless, naive child who had underestimated the sheer ruthlessness of her own parents. I reached across the table and gently touched Grandpa's arm. "Please forgive me," I whispered, my voice raw with grief. "I will find a way to fix this. I swear to you I will figure it out. I just need time." Grandpa Jeremiah did not look panicked. He did not look scared, and he certainly did not look like a broken man who had just been thrown out into a blizzard. He slowly set his plastic spoon down on the table. He reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat and pulled out a plain white paper napkin. He reached across the table and gently wiped the tears and blood from my cheek. His hand was remarkably steady. We finished the soup in silence. The hot broth brought some color back to his cheeks, but the reality of our situation still hung heavy in the greasy air of the diner. I paid the bill with a $20 bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress who had shown us more grace than my own mother. I bundled Grandpa Jeremiah back into his coat and pushed him back out into the freezing night. The sleet had turned to a hard driving snow. The roadside motel was exactly as advertised. It was a bleak cinder block building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. The room smelled of bleach and old cigarette smoke. The floral bedspreads were thin and worn. I wheeled Grandpa inside, locked the flimsy deadbolt, and immediately turned the radiator on high. I stripped off my wet jacket and knelt in front of his wheelchair to check his hands for frostbite. My mind was racing, trying to calculate how to liquidate my meager retirement fund without penalty, how to secure an emergency supply of insulin by tomorrow, and how we were going to survive. I was lost in my own desperate math when Grandpa Jeremiah placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Stop calculating, Chloe," he said. His voice was no longer the quiet, agreeable tone he used around my father. It was sharp. It held the commanding resonance of a man accustomed to giving orders. I looked up startled. "Grandpa, we have to calculate." Reginald froze the accounts. "We have $30 left." I said, "Stop." He repeated softly but firmly. He leaned forward and reached inside his heavy wool coat. His fingers fumbled along the inner lining near his chest. I heard the faint sound of fabric tearing. He had deliberately ripped a hidden seam. "Grandpa? What are you doing?" I asked, panic rising again. I thought the extreme cold had finally gotten to him. Hypothermia could cause confusion and erratic behavior. I reached out to stop his hands, but he batted my fingers away with surprising speed. From deep within the lining of his coat, he pulled out 2 items. He placed them flat on his palm and held them out to me. One was a heavy weathered brass key with a serial number stamped on the side. The other was a crisp piece of thick cardstock paper with a single phone number printed on it. Nothing else. "Take them," he commanded. I stared at the items, my confusion morphing into genuine fear for his mental state. "Grandpa, please, you are exhausted. We need to get you into bed so you can warm up. I will call a clinic in the morning." He let out a sharp sigh. "You always were the smartest person in that house, Chloe. The only one who bothered to look past the surface. But right now you are treating me like a senile old man. I am 82, not brain dead. I am perfectly lucid. And I need you to listen to me very carefully." His tone was so authoritative and so entirely different from the passive grandfather I knew that I reflexively took the key and the paper from his hand. The brass was cold. The paper felt like expensive watermarked stationery. "Reginald and Vivian thought I was a burden," Grandpa Jeremiah continued. His eyes narrowed, flashing with a brilliant, dangerous clarity. "Connor called me a freeloader. They thought they were the masters of their universe, dictating who gets to eat at their table and who gets thrown into the snow. But they forgot one fundamental rule of business. You never show your hand until you know exactly who is sitting across the table." I shook my head desperately, trying to follow his logic. "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" "I was testing them, Chloe. I have been testing them for the last 3 years. I needed to see what they would do when they thought I had absolutely nothing left to offer. I needed to see if my own son had a shred of decency left in his soul after drowning in country club debt and keeping up appearances." He leaned back in his wheelchair, resting his hands on the armrests. He looked around the dingy motel room with utter disgust. "They failed the test, Chloe. They failed spectacularly. But you put yourself in the line of fire for me. You took a slap to the face and walked into a blizzard to protect an old man you thought was penniless. You passed." I stared at the phone number on the cardstock. "Passed what?" "Make the call," he instructed. "Tell the man who answers that Jeremiah needs to initiate Protocol Delta, and give him the serial number on that key." My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I was entirely convinced that my grandfather was experiencing a severe medical episode. Protocol Delta. Serial numbers. It sounded like a spy novel, not the reality of a retired shipping yard worker, but the intensity in his eyes left me no room to argue. I dialed the 10-digit number, fully expecting to hear a disconnected line or a generic voicemail. The line rang exactly once before a crisp professional voice answered. Harrison Financial. This is a secure line. Please state your authorization. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. I looked at Grandpa Jeremiah. He nodded once. I am calling for Jeremiah, I stammered. He said to initiate Protocol Delta. There was a pause. The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy. When the voice returned, the generic customer service tone had completely vanished. It was replaced by an urgent, highly focused deference. Understood. Please verify the serial number on the physical key. I looked down at the heavy brass key in my palm. 8472, Alpha 9. Authentication confirmed. Good evening, Mr. Harrison. We have been awaiting your directive. Is everything secure? Mr. Harrison. My grandfather was Jeremiah Harrison, but nobody ever called him Mr. Harrison with that level of profound respect. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the small laminate table between the two motel beds. Everything is secure, Julian Grandpa spoke up. His voice resonated with undeniable power. I have my granddaughter Chloe with me. She will be acting as my primary auditor and proxy moving forward. Bring her up to speed immediately. Yes, sir, the man named Julian replied without a second of hesitation. Ms. Harrison, my name is Julian Sterling. I am the senior asset manager at Sterling and Croft in Manhattan. I oversee your grandfather's private wealth portfolio. I assume you are currently in an uncompromised location. We are in a motel off the highway, I said, still struggling to comprehend what was happening. My father just froze the medical trust. We have $30. What portfolio are you talking about? Julian cleared his throat. Ms. Harrison, the medical trust was a decoy account. Your grandfather instructed us to establish a highly visible low-yield account specifically for your father to manage. It was designed to create the illusion of dependency. Illusion, I repeated. My brain, wired for strict financial logic, was completely short-circuiting. Grandpa, you worked at the shipping yards. I own the shipping yards, Chloe, Grandpa corrected gently. I bought them in 1987 through a proxy corporation. Over the next 2 decades, I built a logistics and commercial freight empire across the eastern seaboard. I sold the entire operation to an international conglomerate in 2005. I structured the sale entirely through anonymous holding companies to protect my privacy and shield the assets from greedy relatives. Julian Sterling chimed in over the speakerphone. To be precise, Ms. Harrison, your grandfather's current liquid and physical assets are diversified across multiple international markets, high-yield real estate and municipal bonds. His verified net worth, as of the close of markets yesterday, is $1.8 billion. The number hit me with the force of a freight train. 1.8 billion. I dropped into the cheap plastic chair next to the motel window. I could not breathe. I could not speak. I looked at the man in the wheelchair, the man who wore faded sweaters, the man who let Connor insult him over scuff marks on a hardwood floor. You are a billionaire, I gasped. And you let them treat you like a burden. You let Reginald shove you out the door. I needed absolute proof of their character, Grandpa said, his eyes hardening into flint. Money acts as a magnifying glass, Chloe. It reveals exactly who people really are. Reginald showed me that he values country club status over his own flesh and blood. Jada showed me she is a hollow shell of entitlement, and that pathetic husband of hers showed me he is nothing but a thief. They thought they held all the power. They thought I was defenseless. He leaned forward, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. Julian, tell my granddaughter about the primary holding company, the one stationed in Delaware. Yes, sir, Julian said. Ms. Harrison, 4 years ago, your father Reginald found himself in severe financial distress due to over-leveraging his personal assets to fund his son-in-law's failed investments. To avoid public bankruptcy, Reginald quietly sold the deed to the family estate in Buckhead to a private real estate holding firm called Apex Holdings. He currently leases the property back from the firm to maintain his public image. I stared at the phone, my financial auditor instincts rapidly piecing the massive puzzle together. Apex Holdings. You own Apex Holdings. Grandpa Jeremiah nodded. I am the sole proprietor. I bought their house out from under them 4 years ago. Reginald has been paying rent to me this entire time and he has absolutely no idea. The sheer brilliance of the trap was staggering. Reginald had shoved us out into the snow, locking the door to a house he did not even own. He had violently evicted the actual landlord. Julian Grandpa commanded. I want you to initiate the asset transfer protocols, give Chloe full executive access to the portfolio, and secure us a penthouse in the city center by morning. We are done playing the victim. It is time to go to work. Julian Sterling did not exaggerate his efficiency. Less than 3 hours later, while the winter storm still battered the cheap motel window, a sleek black Maybach pulled into the icy parking lot. A man in a tailored overcoat stepped out holding a large umbrella and a thermos of premium hot tea. He handled Grandpa's wheelchair with the utmost respect, guiding us into the heated leather interior of the luxury vehicle. The contrast was staggering. We went from freezing on a concrete porch with only $30 to gliding silently through the deserted Atlanta streets in absolute comfort. By sunrise, we were taking a private glass elevator up to the top floor of a secure, ultra-luxury high-rise in the heart of the city. The penthouse was breathtaking. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline, custom modern art, and a dedicated medical suite that Julian had already staffed with a rotating team of top-tier private nurses. Grandpa Jeremiah would never have to worry about a delayed insulin shipment or a compromised medical trust ever again. The days of him being treated like a burden were permanently over. My new domain was a sprawling home office equipped with 3 massive monitors and enterprise-grade encrypted servers. Julian had overnighted a secure laptop containing the master ledgers for Sterling and Croft. When I logged in for the first time and saw the 9-figure balances scattered across global markets, I had to remind myself to breathe. My entire career had trained me for this exact moment. I spent my days hunting down corporate fraud and balancing complex budgets for massive firms. Now I was applying those lethal auditing skills to my own bloodline. The next few months were a masterclass in surveillance and financial dissection. We did not contact my parents. We did not answer any calls from external family members. We simply vanished into our fortified sky mansion and watched them from above. Grandpa had eyes and ears everywhere, from private investigators to subtle financial trackers embedded in the holding companies interacting with my father. I even conducted a small calculated test of my own. 2 months into our penthouse stay, I used a burner phone to call my mother. I left a voicemail fabricating a story about struggling to afford groceries, asking for a mere $20 loan. Vivian never called back. The silence confirmed everything we needed to know. They truly believed we were rotting in a homeless shelter, and they were perfectly content to leave us there. It did not take long for me to peel back the decaying layers of Reginald and Vivian's perfectly curated image. Sitting in the quiet hum of my penthouse office, tracking the routing numbers related to Apex Holdings, I uncovered the full extent of my father's desperation. Reginald was not just struggling. He was staring down the barrel of total financial annihilation. I watched the digital paper trail as Reginald frantically moved money between drained accounts to cover the monthly lease on the Buckhead mansion. He was taking out predatory high-interest loans just to pay the landscaping crews and the catering staff, so his society friends would not suspect a thing. He was officially insolvent, facing a quiet, impending bankruptcy. His entire identity, his obsession with maintaining that flawless black excellence facade, was built on a crumbling foundation of debt. Vivian was completely oblivious, continuing to host lavish charity luncheons and ordering imported dresses while my father desperately tried to plug the holes in a sinking ship. Jada was equally ignorant, swiping credit cards that were constantly declining and demanding Reginald fix the limits. But the most satisfying discovery came when I turned my crosshairs onto Connor. Jada's arrogant, freeloading husband had always boasted about his business acumen. I decided to audit the transaction histories connecting his accounts to my parents. What I found was not just gross incompetence, it was a textbook felony. Reginald, in his desperation to legitimize his white son-in-law within their elite circles, had helped Connor secure a position on the treasury board of their prestigious country club's annual gala fund. It was a massive pool of money meant for high-profile charitable donations. Using my forensic accounting software, I traced a series of highly suspicious, obfuscated wire transfers bleeding out of that charity fund. Connor was not just a failed crypto investor, he was an active embezzler. He had been siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from the country club accounts, routing the stolen capital through a maze of dummy corporations, and dumping the cash directly into offshore cryptocurrency exchanges to cover his catastrophic trading margins. He was literally stealing from Atlanta's wealthiest families to hide his massive market failures. The digital footprint he left behind was incredibly sloppy. For a man who mocked my profession, he possessed absolutely zero understanding of how easily a trained auditor could dismantle his entire laundering scheme. I printed out the ledgers, the wire receipts, and the corresponding crypto wallet addresses. I laid the thick stack of papers on the dining table in front of Grandpa Jeremiah. We were eating a flawless breakfast prepared by our private chef. I slid the damning evidence across the marble surface. Grandpa picked up his reading glasses. He reviewed the documents in silence, his eyes scanning the highlighted offshore transfers. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. He is stealing from the very people your parents spend their entire lives trying to impress. Grandpa noted, setting the papers down. When that fund is audited for the gala, Connor will face federal prison and Reginald will be dragged down with him for sponsoring his treasury seat. I nodded, sipping my coffee and looking out over the sprawling city. The trap is already set, Grandpa. We do not even have to do anything but wait. They are digging their own graves. Grandpa looked at the skyline, the morning light reflecting off the skyscrapers he secretly owned. Let them dig, Chloe. Give them enough rope and they will tie the noose themselves. We have all the time and all the capital in the world. Spring arrived in Atlanta, and with it came the relentless pressure of the high society social season. For my family, appearing wealthy was far more important than actually being wealthy. Through my ongoing monitoring of Reginald's dwindling accounts, I noticed a sudden massive spike in outgoing deposits. Jada and Connor were planning a lavish 5-year vow renewal ceremony. I watched the digital paper trail as Reginald maxed out his final 2 credit cards to secure the venue at a prestigious botanical garden. Jada was posting daily updates on her social media showcasing diamond fittings and cake tastings, completely oblivious to the fact that her father was facing financial execution. But the deposits were only the beginning. The final vendor invoices were coming due, and Reginald had absolutely zero liquidity left. The well was completely dry. That is when my system flagged a new, deeply disturbing document filed in the county probate court. I opened the scanned document on my massive monitors and felt a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. Reginald and Vivian had filed a formal legal petition to declare Grandpa Jeremiah mentally incompetent and a ward of the state in absentia. They claimed he suffered from severe dementia and had been abducted by an unstable family member. Why would they risk opening a legal investigation? I dug into the attached financial schedules and found my answer. They were attempting to seize control of a $50,000 whole life insurance policy that Grandpa had taken out decades ago. They were trying to legally strip a living, breathing man of his autonomy, effectively declaring him financially dead just so they could liquidate his life insurance to pay the final catering bill for Jada's vanity project. They were ready to commit elder abuse on paper to ensure their society friends had enough champagne and caviar. I printed the probate filing and brought it straight to Grandpa Jeremiah. He read the legal petition while sitting on the sunlit balcony of our penthouse. He did not look angry. He just shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. I asked him how he wanted to handle it. He handed the paper back to me and told me to crush them. I immediately contacted Julian Sterling. We unleashed Grandpa Jeremiah's legal team, a shark tank of Manhattan litigators who charged more per hour than Reginald made in a month. We filed a swift, brutal, and airtight injunction to block the incompetency motion. We submitted certified affidavits from 3 different board-certified neurologists confirming Grandpa's absolute mental clarity. We tied the probate court in so much red tape that the judge immediately froze the life insurance policy indefinitely. But I made sure my name and our current location remained entirely off the paperwork, using Julian's proxy firms to file the response. The blowback was instantaneous and glorious. With the insurance policy frozen, Reginald could not pay the remaining balances for the vow renewal. The caterers threatened to walk. The florists paused their orders. The carefully constructed facade was cracking right before the big day. My burner phone began vibrating relentlessly on my desk. It was my parents. I did not answer. I simply let the voicemails pile up, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee before pressing play on the first message. Reginald's voice exploded through the speaker, frantic and dripping with rage. "Chloe, I know you are behind this legal stunt. You think you are so smart dragging that old man to some free pro bono legal clinic downtown? You are interfering with highly sensitive family finances. You drop this injunction right now, or I swear to you, I will have the police arrest you for kidnapping. You stole an elderly man with dementia." The next voicemail was from Vivian. Her usual polished tone was completely unhinged. "You selfish, bitter little girl," she shrieked into the phone. "Jada's vow renewal is in 2 weeks, and you are trying to ruin her special day because you are jealous. You bring him back to the proper authorities immediately. We are his legal next of kin. You are nothing but a disgrace to this family." I sat back in my plush leather office chair and listened to their empty threats. They were completely delusional. They honestly believed I was sitting in a homeless shelter begging a public defender to file paperwork on our behalf. They were accusing me of kidnapping the very man they had violently shoved into a snowstorm and locked out of his own house. They threatened police action, but I knew they would never actually call the authorities. A police investigation would require an audit of their finances. It would expose the fact that Reginald was broke. It would expose Connor's embezzlement from the country club. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, barking orders at a daughter they could no longer control. I deleted the voicemails and turned my phone off. I did not send a single text back. I did not engage in their manufactured drama. I simply let them dig their hole deeper, knowing that the walls were about to cave in. The caterers would demand their money. The guests would arrive expecting a spectacle, and Reginald and Vivian would have to smile through the crushing anxiety of their impending financial collapse. The trap was perfectly set, and all I had to do was watch them step right into it. The stifling heat of an Atlanta summer pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, a stark contrast to the freezing winter night that had brought us here. It had been exactly 6 months since my parents locked us out in the snow. 6 months of peace, of meticulous planning, and of giving Grandpa Jeremiah the absolute best care that unlimited capital could buy. But money, even $1 billion of it, cannot buy time. His health had been steadily declining over the last 3 weeks. His heart, which had endured 82 years of hard labor, quiet observation, and ultimate triumph, was finally slowing down. The private medical team we had hired on our first day in the penthouse informed me that the end was approaching. I immediately halted all my corporate auditing contracts. I moved my entire workstation directly into his suite, setting up my encrypted monitors at the foot of his medical bed so I would not miss a single moment with him. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting a warm golden glow across his room. The specialized medical equipment hummed softly in the background. I was reviewing the latest legal filings against Connor's embezzled funds when I heard a soft rustle of sheets. Grandpa Jeremiah reached out with a frail, trembling hand. I immediately pushed my chair away from the desk and rushed to the edge of the bed. I took his hand in both of mine. His skin felt incredibly thin, but his grip was steady. He looked at me, and there was absolutely no fear in his eyes. There was only immense pride and a deep, settling peace. "You did good, Chloe," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the oxygen machine. "You protected me. You gave me dignity when my own son wanted to strip it away." I swallowed hard, fighting the lump forming in my throat. "I just did what anyone who loved you should have done, Grandpa." He offered a weak, knowing smile. "Love is action, Chloe. Remember that. They are going to try to tear you down when I am gone. They will use guilt, they will use family obligation, and they will use every manipulation tactic they possess. Do not let them. You protect yourself now. Execute the final phase exactly as we planned." I squeezed his hand, the tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheeks. "I promise you, Grandpa, I will not give them a single inch." His smile softened, and his eyes drifted toward the large window facing the setting sun. He took one slow, deep breath, exhaled quietly, and closed his eyes. His grip on my hand relaxed. The heart monitor beside the bed emitted a steady, flat tone. He slipped away entirely peacefully, surrounded by quiet luxury and genuine love. The silence in the grand suite was deafening. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, holding his lifeless hand. I allowed myself to cry. I wept for the man who had been my only true family. I mourned the decades I had wasted seeking validation from parents who only viewed me as an inconvenience. But I did not spiral into despair. Grandpa Jeremiah had trained me far better than that. I kissed his forehead, wiped my face, and called the medical staff in from the adjoining room to respectfully handle his remains. Then I walked straight back to my office. There was no time for exhaustion. I opened my encrypted communication channels and contacted Julian Sterling in Manhattan. "He is gone." I stated, my voice completely stripped of emotion. Julian offered his sincere condolences, his professional tone softening with genuine respect for my grandfather. But I cut the pleasantries short. I needed to operate with surgical precision. "Initiate the final protocols," Julian I commanded. "We lock the gates today." Over the next 48 hours, I operated on pure adrenaline and auditor instinct. We welded the legal steel trap completely shut. I personally verified the final deeds for Apex Holdings, ensuring that Reginald's lease on the Buckhead mansion was airtight and subjected to an immediate termination clause upon any default or breach of contract. I cross-referenced the surveillance files on Connor's offshore accounts, confirming that the digital evidence of his country club embezzlement was packaged and ready to be anonymously forwarded to federal investigators the moment I gave the signal. Next, we prepared the formal summons for the will reading. Grandpa had crafted his final testament with absolute genius. He had included a strict mandatory attendance clause. If Reginald, Vivian, Jada, or Connor wanted to lay claim to a single dime of his estate, they had to be physically present in the boardroom of our designated law firm. They could not send proxies. They could not ignore the summons. They had to show up and face the music. Once every single legal snare was set, tested, and finalized, I picked up my burner phone. It was time to make the notification. I dialed Reginald's personal cell number. It took 4 rings before he answered. His voice was thick with annoyance, carrying the heavy stress of a man buckling under financial ruin. "Chloe," he scoffed, not bothering with a greeting. "Are you finally calling to beg for forgiveness? Did the reality of being cut off finally hit you?" I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy detachment of a mortician. "Grandpa Jeremiah passed away last night. The funeral arrangements have already been paid for by a private benefactor. You will receive the location details via courier this afternoon." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but it was not a gasp of grief. It was the sound of immediate ravenous greed. "Passed away?" Reginald repeated, his tone shifting into rapid calculation. "What about his life insurance policy? The state froze it because of your little legal stunt. We are his legal next of kin. We need those funds released immediately to cover the remaining vendor balances from Jada's ceremony." I stared out the penthouse window, disgusted but entirely unsurprised. He did not ask if his father had been in pain. He did not ask if he was peaceful at the end. He asked about the payout. "You will receive a formal summons from his legal representation regarding the disposition of his estate," I replied coldly. "Attendance is mandatory. Do not contact this number again." I hung up the phone before he could utter another word. I popped the back off the burner device, snapped the SIM card in half, and tossed the pieces into the trash. The board was officially set. The final game was about to begin, and they were walking blindfolded right into the slaughter. The funeral took place 3 days later at a historic and deeply private chapel in Midtown Atlanta. I arranged everything through Julian, ensuring the invoice was paid by a blind trust so my parents could not trace the money back to me. The chapel was filled with white lilies, soft organ music, and a scattering of older men in sharp suits who were hired associates instructed to play the part of Grandpa's old shipping colleagues. I sat in the second row, wearing a simple tailored black dress, quietly observing the heavy mahogany casket that held the only person who had ever truly loved me. The heavy chapel doors swung open, and Reginald, Vivian, Jida, and Connor made their grand entrance. They did not look like a family in mourning. They looked like they were arriving at a red carpet premiere. Vivian wore a dramatic black fascinator with a veil that partially obscured her face, and she clutched a designer handkerchief as if preparing for a photo shoot. Jada was poured into a skin-tight black velvet dress that was entirely inappropriate for a funeral, balancing precariously on stiletto heels. Connor trailed behind them, checking his phone and looking deeply inconvenienced by the entire ordeal. Before they even reached the first row, Jada stopped right in the center aisle. She lifted her phone, angling the camera high to capture the mahogany casket in the background. She put on a tragically brave face and recorded a live video. Saying goodbye to our beloved patriarch today, she whispered to her followers, squeezing out a single manufactured tear. Family is everything, so please keep us in your prayers. Connor stood next to her, adjusting his tie and practically vibrating with impatience. They were not here to honor the man who built their foundation. They were here to harvest sympathy and keep up appearances for their country club peers. Vivian spotted me sitting quietly near the front. Her performative grief instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, unfiltered hostility. She marched down the aisle, her heels clicking aggressively against the stone floor. She stopped right beside my pew and leaned down so only I could hear her. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Vivian," hissed her voice dripping with venom. "After you kidnapped him and dragged him to some disease-infested shelter, you think you can sit in the front. You are a disgrace to this family. Get up and move to the back row where you belong." I looked up at my mother. I looked at the faux pearl necklace resting against her collarbone, a piece of jewelry Reginald had bought her using predatory credit card debt. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sorrow, just a cold and clinical detachment. I did not argue. I did not cause a scene. I simply gave her a slow, hollow smile. "Whatever makes you comfortable, Vivian," I replied softly. I stood up, smoothed out my dress, and walked down the long aisle to the very last row in the chapel. I was more than happy to let her have the front seat. She was going to need a front row view for the absolute destruction I had prepared for her. The service was brief and dignified, completely ignoring the toxic energy radiating from the front pew. Reginald sat incredibly tall, puffing out his chest, acting the part of the grieving and powerful son. Connor spent the entire 20-minute eulogy tapping his foot and glaring at his smartwatch, clearly sweating over whatever crypto margin calls were currently bleeding his accounts dry. When the service concluded, they immediately stood up, ready to rush out and get back to their financial maneuvering. But Julian Sterling had sent one of his best men to deliver the bait. A tall man in an immaculate charcoal gray suit stepped directly into Reginald's path as he turned to leave the front pew. The man carried a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. "Reginald Harrison." The man asked, his tone perfectly neutral and dripping with authority. Reginald straightened his posture, sizing the man up with his usual arrogance. "I am he. Who are you?" "Who are—" "I represent the legal firm handling the estate of the late Jeremiah Harrison," the man stated clearly, his voice carrying through the quiet chapel. He extended the sealed envelope. "This is a formal summons. The reading of his last will and testament will take place tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Attendance by all immediate family members is strictly mandatory." Reginald snatched the envelope from the lawyer's hand. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the embossed logo of one of the most prestigious and expensive law firms in the country. Vivian leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting greedily over the gold foil lettering. Jada and Connor practically shoved each other out of the way to get a closer look. I watched from the shadows of the back row as their body language completely transformed from fake mourning to ravenous anticipation. The fake grief evaporated entirely. Connor let out a low whistle and rubbed his hands together. Mandatory attendance at a high-end firm, Connor muttered to Reginald, loud enough for me to hear from the back. The old man must have had a hidden life insurance policy we did not know about. Or maybe the private benefactor who paid for this funeral set up a trust. This is it, Reginald. This is the bailout we need to clear my accounts and pay off the caterers. Reginald nodded, a smug and greedy smile spreading across his face. He tapped the thick envelope against his palm, his chest puffing out with absolute arrogance. I told you, Connor, Reginald said proudly. The patriarch always takes care of his son first. Whatever scraps he had left, they rightfully belong to the head of this family. We are finally getting our payout. They were positively glowing. They were standing mere feet away from my grandfather's casket, openly salivating over the prospect of inheriting what they assumed was a $50,000 policy. They were so blinded by their own desperation and hubris that they could not see the massive crushing anvil hanging directly over their heads. They thought they had finally won. I stood up in the quiet shadows of the back row. I pulled my black coat over my shoulders and slipped silently out the side door of the chapel. My black car was waiting by the curb. I climbed into the back seat, staring straight ahead at the Atlanta skyline. Take me to the boardroom, I told the driver. The bait had been swallowed whole, and tomorrow morning I was going to snap the trap shut. The glass walls of the Sterling and Croft boardroom offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a crisp and cloudless morning. I sat perfectly still at the far end of a massive polished marble conference table. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. My posture was straight, and my hands rested quietly in my lap. I had arrived a full hour early to review the final execution documents with Julian Sterling. Now the trap was completely set. I simply had to wait for the mice to walk through the door. They arrived exactly 1 minute before 10 o'clock. The heavy glass doors swung open and my family marched into the boardroom in a tight, aggressive pack. They radiated a desperate and suffocating arrogance. They were putting on a masterful performance of generational wealth, but my trained auditor's eyes ripped right through their pathetic facade. Vivian walked in first. She was clutching a pristine Birkin bag and wearing a designer silk blouse. I knew for an absolute fact that the credit card she used to purchase that bag had a 29% interest rate and was currently maxed out. Reginald followed her, projecting the false authority of a powerful patriarch. He wore a custom-tailored suit that he could no longer afford to dry clean. Jada and Connor trailed behind them. My sister was draped in an expensive cashmere wrap, actively ignoring the reality that she was married to an unemployed criminal. Connor strutted into the room like he had just conquered the city. He pulled out a leather executive chair for Jada, flashing a heavy gold watch on his wrist. I stared directly at that watch. I knew the exact routing numbers he had used to embezzle the funds to buy it. He was wearing stolen country club charity money on his wrist while acting like a king. When they finally noticed me sitting at the far end of the long marble table, their collective smugness faltered for a fraction of a second. Vivian scowled, her lips curling into a tight line of pure disgust. "What is she doing here?" Vivian snapped, turning her head to glare at Reginald. "This is a private legal meeting for the immediate family. Did you follow us here to beg for a handout, Chloe?" I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I was legally summoned. "Vivian," I replied coldly. "My name is on the document just like yours. Feel free to take a seat. The reading is about to begin." Reginald scoffed, pulling out a chair at the head of the table. He positioned himself exactly opposite from me, attempting to establish dominance over the room. "Let her stay, Vivian," he said, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "She probably hopes the old man left her a few $100s to pay her rent." It will be a good lesson for her to watch how a real family legacy is passed down to the rightful heirs. Connor chuckled, taking his seat next to Jada. He leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head. Do not get your hopes up, Chloe. I doubt your little stunt at the diner earned you anything more than a bus pass. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy glass doors opened again. Julian Sterling walked into the boardroom. He did not offer friendly smiles. He did not offer handshakes. He moved with the chilling precision of a corporate executioner. He carried a single thick black leather folder. He took his place at the center of the marble table, standing perfectly straight as he surveyed the room. Good morning, Julian stated, his voice carrying absolute authority. I am Julian Sterling, senior partner at Sterling and Croft. I am the primary executor of the estate of the late Jeremiah Harrison. I expect absolute silence while the testament is read. Reginald adjusted his tie, puffing out his chest. He flashed Julian a familiar, entitled smile. Thank you for handling this, Mr. Sterling. My father was a simple man, but we appreciate your firm taking the time to process his remaining affairs. I am ready to sign wherever necessary to transfer the life insurance policy into my primary accounts. We have some outstanding vendor invoices that require immediate liquidation. Julian did not smile back. He looked at Reginald with an expression of profound clinical emptiness. Mr. Harrison, I advise you to listen closely and hold your questions until the reading is concluded. You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with today. Reginald's arrogant smile slipped. He cleared his throat and nodded, gesturing for Julian to proceed. Julian opened the thick black leather folder. The crisp sound of the heavy parchment paper turning echoed loudly in the silent boardroom. He bypassed the standard preamble and went straight to the core of the document. We will begin with the categorization and distribution of the physical estate, Julian announced, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. This includes all active corporate holdings, physical real estate assets, and municipal land deeds currently under the direct ownership of the deceased. The moment the words real estate assets left Julian's mouth, Connor let out a loud, obnoxious burst of laughter. The sound was sharp and incredibly jarring. It shattered the professional decorum of the boardroom. Connor leaned heavily against the marble table, shaking his head in absolute amusement. He looked directly across the room at me, his eyes filled with vicious, mocking delight. Real estate assets, Connor wheezed, wiping a fake tear from his eye. What real estate assets? Did the old man leave you a cardboard box under a highway overpass, Chloe? Because that is the only real estate he could afford. Maybe it comes with a shopping cart if you are lucky. Jada snickered, covering her mouth to hide her cruel amusement. Vivian smiled a tight, satisfied smirk, completely validating her son-in-law's horrific disrespect. Reginald raised a hand to silence them, but the proud gleam in his eye made it entirely clear that he agreed with every single word Connor had just said. I did not look away. I stared dead into Connor's eyes. I kept my face completely devoid of any emotion. I let his mocking laughter bounce off the glass walls of the boardroom. I let him enjoy his final few seconds of manufactured superiority. I sat perfectly still, watching the arrogant parasite mock a billionaire whose wealth was about to crush him into absolute dust. I did not need to say a word. I just waited for Julian to turn the page. Julian did not even blink at Connor's outburst. He did not reprimand him or ask for order. He simply turned the heavy parchment page of the legal binder, completely unfazed by the arrogant display. The crisp rustle of the thick paper sounded like a blade being sharpened. The physical real estate holdings of the Jeremiah Harrison Trust include but are not limited to the following fully owned and unencumbered commercial properties, Julian stated. His voice was a flat, rhythmic drumbeat of absolute destruction. 3 Class A commercial skyscrapers located in the financial district of Manhattan. 2 high-rise luxury residential complexes in downtown Chicago. And 4 commercial office towers located right here in the greater Atlanta metropolitan area. Connor stopped laughing. The smug grin slid right off his face, replaced by a deep and furrowed confusion. He looked at Jada, waiting for her to roll her eyes at what he assumed was a typographical error. But Jada was staring at Julian, her mouth slightly parted, her perfectly manicured hands frozen in mid-air. Vivian shifted in her chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the tense room. Mr. Sterling, I believe you have grabbed the wrong client file. My father-in-law was a retired shipping yard worker. He did not own skyscrapers in Manhattan. I assure you, Mrs. Harrison, I have the correct file, Julian replied coldly, not bothering to look up from the pages. To continue. The estate also maintains absolute ownership of a diversified international stock portfolio, focusing heavily on emerging tech sectors, and sustainable energy currently managed by offshore accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, the estate holds significant liquid assets distributed across 5 separate private wealth management firms. Reginald leaned forward. He gripped the edge of the marble table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. The color was rapidly draining from his face. The reality of his impending financial salvation was clashing violently with the absolute impossibility of the words being spoken. Mr. Sterling, this is an absurd prank, Reginald interrupted, his voice trembling with a mixture of panic and aggressive denial. Are you telling me my father, a man who sat in a wheelchair and wore thrift store sweaters, secretly owned high-rises in Chicago and international stock portfolios? Julian finally looked up from the leather folder. He met Reginald's frantic gaze with eyes like twin stones of ice. I am not telling you a story, Mr. Harrison. I am reading a legally binding, fully audited financial testament. Your father was the sole proprietor of a logistics empire he sold in the late 90s through a series of anonymous holding companies. He quietly reinvested that capital over the last 2 decades with unparalleled market foresight. Julian turned to the final page of the summary document. He smoothed the paper flat with his hand. After all outstanding taxes, legal fees, and administrative costs have been accounted for, the total verified net worth of the Jeremiah Harrison estate, including all physical properties, international portfolios, and liquid capital, is officially valued at $1.8 billion. The number hung in the air. $1.8 billion. The silence that slammed into the glass boardroom was absolute and terrifying. It was a dead, suffocating vacuum. The air was completely sucked out of the room. I could hear the faint, rapid ticking of the stolen gold watch on Connor's wrist. The sheer magnitude of the number crushed the oxygen from their lungs. Billion. With a B. Vivian's pristine designer handbag, the one she had bought on a high-interest credit card to impress her country club friends, slid off her lap. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling lipstick and mints across the polished marble tiles. She did not even flinch. She sat paralyzed, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the lawyer as if he had just spoken in a demonic tongue. Reginald's jaw literally fell open. His mouth worked silently, trying to form words that his brain simply could not process. The man who had spent his entire life obsessing over status, who had taken out a second mortgage just to maintain the illusion of being a millionaire, had just realized his own father was an actual verified billionaire. The sheer humiliation of knowing he had shoved a billionaire out into the snow to impress a broke crypto bro was visibly short-circuiting his mind. Jada looked physically ill. The color had completely vanished from her carefully contoured face. She looked at Connor, her eyes wide with a sudden, frantic realization. All the money they had been desperate to steal, all the elder abuse they had planned over a $50,000 life insurance policy, was nothing but a microscopic speck of dust compared to the mountain of wealth sitting in the center of the table. Connor looked like he had been struck by a high-speed train. His arrogant posture collapsed completely. He slumped back into his executive chair, his mouth hanging open. The man who had called my grandfather a freeloader, a burden, a useless old man taking up space, was now hyperventilating. He was doing the math in his head. He was realizing that the man he had verbally abused on Christmas Eve could have bought and sold him 10,000 times over before breakfast. I sat at the end of the table, perfectly composed. My posture remained impeccable. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched the sheer, unadulterated shock dismantle their entire world brick by brick. They had worshipped money their entire lives. They had sacrificed their own blood at the altar of wealth and public perception. And now the ultimate prize was sitting right in front of them, dangling just out of reach. Reginald was the first to break the suffocating silence. He gasped for air, his chest heaving violently. He slammed both of his hands onto the marble table, leaning forward with his eyes wide. The shock was immediately replaced by a sudden, ravenous, uncontrollable greed. The panic of his impending bankruptcy vanished, replaced by the absolute certainty of his own entitlement. Reginald slapped his palms on the marble so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "So how is it structured, Julian?" His voice was breathless, entirely stripped of its usual measured cadence. The sheer greed had completely overtaken his professional veneer. "As his only son, I am assuming the primary holding companies bypass probate and transfer directly into my name. We need to expedite the liquid assets immediately. Connor has investments we need to secure, and Jada has upcoming vendor deadlines." Vivian was nodding frantically. She had completely forgotten about her dropped designer bag. "Yes, exactly," she chimed in, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "We will need the account routing numbers today. Obviously, we will make sure Chloe is given a small stipend for her troubles, perhaps enough to cover her rent for the year, but the bulk of the estate needs to be consolidated under Reginald's authority immediately. We have a legacy to uphold." Connor let out a shaky, triumphant breath, sinking back into his chair. He ran a hand through his hair, looking at Jada as if they had just won the lottery. "I told you," he muttered to her. "I told you the old man was holding out. Think about the seed capital. We are going to be unstoppable." I sat at the end of the table and watched the three of them carve up a carcass they did not even own. They were so deeply infected by their own entitlement that the concept of facing consequences for their actions simply did not exist in their universe. They actually believed that after abusing, humiliating, and discarding an 82-year-old man, they were going to be rewarded with his empire. Julian Sterling did not reach for any routing numbers. He did not hand over a single bank document. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black remote control. "Mr. Harrison," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "your father anticipated your exact response. He explicitly instructed me that before any final distribution of assets is formally read into the record, a personal addendum must be presented." Reginald frowned, his greedy momentum momentarily stalled. "A personal addendum, a letter, a video," Julian corrected. He pointed the remote toward the far end of the boardroom. The massive glass wall behind Julian suddenly darkened, the smart glass turning completely opaque. A hidden projector hummed to life from the ceiling. A massive, high-definition image flashed onto the glass surface. The breath hitched in Vivian's throat. Reginald froze completely. There, projected 10 feet tall in the center of the boardroom, was Grandpa Jeremiah. He was not sitting in his rusted, squeaky wheelchair. He was not wearing the faded, moth-eaten thrift store sweaters that Vivian had always complained about. He was seated behind the massive mahogany desk in our luxury penthouse office, with the breathtaking Atlanta skyline stretching out behind him. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit. A heavy gold Patek Philippe watch rested on his wrist. His posture was impeccable, his shoulders squared, and his eyes burned with the brilliant, intimidating fire of a titan who had conquered global markets. He looked like exactly what he was, a billionaire kingmaker. "Good morning, Reginald," Grandpa Jeremiah said from the screen. His voice was crisp, powerful, and utterly devoid of the frail, elderly tone he had used to mask his true self for the last 3 years. Reginald physically recoiled in his chair. He stared at the screen as if a ghost had just reached through the glass to grab him by the throat. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead, Grandpa." Jeremiah continued, his piercing gaze seeming to lock directly onto my father. "And it means you are sitting in a very expensive room, salivating over wealth you did not earn, calculating how quickly you can funnel my life's work into your desperate bankrupt charade." Jada whimpered softly, sinking lower into her chair. Connor swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. "I built an empire with my bare hands," Grandpa said, leaning forward on the desk. "I worked until my bones ached so that you, Reginald, would never know the sting of poverty. I paid for your education. I bought your first home. I gave you every advantage a father could possibly provide. But instead of building a legacy of honor, you built a kingdom of lies. You married a woman who values country club gossip over human decency. You raised a daughter who treats money like a toy, and you welcomed a parasitic thief into your home while looking down your nose at your own blood. Reginald opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped, forced to sit and listen to his father dismantle his entire existence from beyond the grave. You thought I was blind, Reginald, the video continued. You thought I did not know about your second mortgage. You thought I did not know about Connor embezzling from your charity boards. You thought I was just a useless, broken old man taking up space in your precious guest wing. But I saw everything. I watched you treat Chloe, my brilliant, loyal granddaughter, like absolute dirt, simply because she refused to participate in your pathetic, shallow illusion. Vivian was shaking now, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Grandpa Jeremiah sat back in his chair, folding his hands together. The disappointment in his voice was heavy and absolute. I gave you a final test on Christmas Eve. I gave you the opportunity to show a shred of basic human compassion. But you failed. You failed me, you failed your daughter, and you failed yourself. He paused, his eyes narrowing into a hardened, ruthless glare. To my son Reginald, who slapped his own daughter, and Vivian, who threw me into the snow, I leave you exactly what you gave me on Christmas: nothing. The word echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. Nothing. You get no cash, Grandpa stated, driving the final nails into their coffin. You get no stocks. You get no commercial properties. I have legally barred you from contesting this document, and any attempt to do so will automatically trigger the release of Connor's embezzlement records to the federal authorities. Connor let out a sharp gasp, grabbing his chest as if he had actually been shot. He stared wildly at the screen, the realization of his impending criminal exposure crashing down on him. You are entirely cut off from the Harrison bloodline. Grandpa finished, his tone dropping to a cold, finalized whisper. Goodbye, Reginald. The screen clicked off, plunging the boardroom back into stark, unforgiving daylight. The silence that followed was dense and immovable. Reginald sat frozen, his mouth agape, his entire identity shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The inheritance he had just spent the last 5 minutes spending in his head was completely gone, leaving him with nothing but his debts and the terrifying reality of his own actions. Julian placed the remote control back inside his jacket pocket. The soft rustle of his suit fabric was the only sound in the boardroom. He stepped back to the center of the marble table and opened the black leather folder one final time. He did not look at my parents. He turned his body and directed his gaze entirely toward me. As per the final binding directive of the late Jeremiah Harrison, Julian announced, his voice slicing through the heavy silence. To my granddaughter Chloe, the only one with a spine and a heart, I leave the entirety of the $1.8 billion estate. This includes sole executive control over all holding companies, immediate transfer of all liquid assets, and complete ownership of the international portfolios. Julian closed the folder. The resounding thud of the leather cover hitting the marble was the starting gun. Absolute, unhinged chaos erupted. Jada shot up from her chair so fast it tipped over backward and crashed onto the floor. She pointed a manicured finger at Julian, her face contorted in sheer panic. That is a fraud, she shrieked. Her voice cracked, echoing shrilly off the glass walls. That video was a deepfake. Chloe hired someone to make that. You cannot legally do this. I am his granddaughter too. I am entitled to half of whatever she gets. We are taking this to court. I will sue this entire firm into the ground. Vivian buried her face in her hands and began sobbing hysterically. Her wails were loud and performative, a desperate attempt to garner sympathy from a room that had absolutely none to give. Reginald remained frozen, his hands still gripping the table, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the blank smart glass where his father had just disowned him. But Connor was not frozen. The sheer terror of his impending federal exposure was rapidly warring with his massive, unearned ego. His face turned a violent, splotchy red. He slammed his fists down on the table, trying to mimic the authority Reginald used to command. This is completely unacceptable, Connor barked, glaring at Julian, and then turning his furious gaze toward me. You think you can just walk in here and steal everything? We house that old man. We took care of him. I put up with his medical equipment cluttering my hallways. I put up with those rubber wheels leaving scuff marks all over my imported floors. I endured immense emotional distress dealing with his presence. I am legally entitled to a settlement. I demand a payout for my pain and suffering. If you do not write me a check right now, I am tying this estate up in litigation for the next decade. I sat at the end of the table and let his pathetic demands wash over me. I looked at this man, a failed crypto investor wearing a stolen watch, demanding compensation for imaginary scuff marks from a billionaire he had verbally abused. I placed my hands flat on the cool marble. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my charcoal suit. I looked at Julian, giving him a brief nod. He stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to me. "Connor," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was heavy with absolute, undeniable authority. It was the voice of a woman who held $1 billion empire in the palm of her hand. Connor stopped yelling. He breathed heavily, his face still red, waiting for me to negotiate. He actually thought he had leverage. "You are demanding a payout for scuff marks," I stated, walking slowly around the edge of the long table. "You are demanding compensation for enduring an 82-year-old man who quietly sat in a wheelchair while you lived rent-free in a mansion funded by debt. You think you can threaten me with litigation." I stopped a few feet away from him. He tried to stand tall, but his eyes betrayed his mounting terror. "Let me explain exactly how this works," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal calm. "You do not have the capital to hire a lawyer to contest a parking ticket, let alone challenge a flawless legal document drafted by Sterling and Croft. But please, I encourage you to try. Because the second you file a single piece of paperwork against this estate, I will personally hand-deliver the audit of your country club treasury accounts to the federal authorities." Connor flinched as if I had struck him. He took a physical step backward. "I know about the dummy corporations, Connor." I continued, stepping closer, pinning him down with my gaze. "I know about the offshore crypto wallets. I know you siphon charity funds to cover your gambling margins. I have the wire receipts. I have the IP logs. I have every single digital fingerprint you carelessly left behind. If you speak another word in this room, if you demand a single penny from my grandfather's legacy, you will not be leaving this building in a taxi. You will be leaving in handcuffs." Connor opened his mouth, but his voice completely abandoned him. He looked at Jada, who was staring at him in absolute horror. She was finally realizing that her husband was not just a failure, but a criminal who had just destroyed their last remaining lifeline. "Sit down and shut your mouth," I commanded. Connor collapsed into his chair. His shoulders slumped forward, his arrogance entirely shattered. He stared at the marble table, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The room fell silent again, save for Vivian's quiet, desperate weeping. I had completely neutralized the loudest threat in the room, but I was not finished. I turned my attention back to my parents. The main event was far from over. I turned my attention away from the trembling parasite and focused entirely on the man sitting at the head of the table. Reginald was staring at the blank glass wall where his father's image had just condemned him. He looked utterly hollowed out. The proud, booming patriarch who had slapped me across the face was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, aging man drowning in an ocean of debt he could no longer hide. I walked back to my seat and picked up a single manila folder I had set aside before the reading began. The heavy paper felt substantial in my hands. It represented the final nail in the coffin of their manufactured reality. I walked down the length of the marble table. The only sound in the room was the sharp click of my heels against the floor. Vivian stopped her performative crying, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Jada shrank back into her chair, realizing that the sister she had mocked her entire life was now holding the executioner's axe. I stopped directly in front of Reginald. He slowly raised his head to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot and completely devoid of their usual arrogance. I placed the manila folder on the polished marble. I pressed my fingertips against the thick paper and slid it firmly across the table. It came to a stop mere inches from his trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded. Reginald stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. His hands shook violently as he reached out and flipped open the cover. Inside sat a pristine, certified copy of the property deed for the sprawling Buckhead mansion. Attached to it was the lease agreement he had signed 4 years ago. He looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. This is the deed to my house. This is the lease I signed with Apex Holdings to maintain the property. I do not understand why you have this. I leaned forward, resting both of my hands on the table, bringing my face perfectly level with his. Oh, by the way, I said, my voice dripping with pure ice. Grandpa owned Apex Holdings. Reginald stopped breathing. His eyes darted from the paperwork back to my face, frantic and completely uncomprehending. Apex Holdings was a shell company created by Julian Sterling under Grandpa's direct instructions. I explained, enunciating every single syllable so the reality could fully penetrate his thick skull. When you quietly went bankrupt 4 years ago and sold the estate to avoid public humiliation, you sold it to your own father. You have been paying rent to the very man you called a freeloader. You financed your country club lifestyle by writing checks to the man whose wheelchair scuff marks offended you so deeply. Vivian let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She grabbed Reginald's arm, digging her manicured nails into his suit jacket. Reginald, tell me she is lying. Tell me we own our home. Reginald could not speak. He stared at the signature on the bottom of the deed, realizing the absolute magnitude of the trap he had been living inside for years. He had handed the keys to his kingdom directly to the man he had abused. He owned the holding company. I continued, standing up straight and looking down at both of them, which means he held the deed to the Atlanta estate. And as of 10 minutes ago, I inherited the entirety of Grandpa's assets. That includes Apex Holdings. I tapped my finger against the manila folder. I own the estate, I stated with absolute finality. I own the imported Brazilian hardwood floors you prized over a human life. I own the guest wing you wanted to clear out. I own every single brick, every chandelier, and every blade of grass on that property. I am your landlord now. And as your landlord, I took the liberty of auditing your recent payment history. You missed your last 2 lease payments to fund Jada's lavish vow renewal catering deposits. That constitutes a material breach of contract. Reginald's face crumbled into a mask of pure devastation. He tried to formulate a sentence, but his voice was nothing more than a pathetic, broken wheeze. Chloe, please, you cannot do this. That house is our entire life, our friends, our reputation, our standing in the community. It is everything we have worked for. You mean everything you faked, I corrected sharply. You built a kingdom of lies and the rent is officially past due. Vivian pushed her chair back and stood up. The arrogance she had worn like armor her entire life completely vanished. She looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest. Chloe, sweetheart. She begged, her voice cracking. You are our daughter. We are family. You cannot put your own mother and father out on the street. Where will we go? How will we survive? We have nothing left. I looked at the woman who had tossed my purse into a snowbank and locked me out into a freezing winter storm. I looked at the woman who had handed her husband a napkin to wipe his hand after he struck my face. I felt a surge of profound satisfaction wash over my entire body. I leaned in close to my mother, making sure she heard every single word with absolute clarity. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property, I told her. The eviction notice is on the second page of that folder. You will pack whatever personal items you can carry. You will leave the furniture, the art, and everything else that belongs to the estate. If you are not gone by noon tomorrow, I will have the private security firm I hired this morning physically remove you from the premises. Vivian let out a gut-wrenching sob and collapsed back into her chair. She buried her face in Reginald's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably. Reginald just stared blankly at the marble table, a completely defeated man. Jada sat frozen, her eyes darting frantically around the room as she realized her massive safety net had just been incinerated. She had no money, a criminal husband facing federal prison, and parents who were about to be homeless. The golden child had finally hit rock bottom. I turned my back on the 4 of them and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I did not look back. I stopped just before the exit, my hand resting on the sleek metal handle. "Oh, and Mom!" I called over my shoulder, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Vivian looked up, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup, hoping for a final ounce of compassion. "Do not worry," I said, giving her a cold, calculated smile. "You can leave through the front door." I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the law firm and out into the warm Atlanta sun. I did not look back at the building. I climbed into the back of my waiting car and sent a single text message to Julian Sterling. It was the green light. Julian did not waste a single second. The encrypted audit files detailing every cent of Connor's country club embezzlement were securely transmitted directly to federal authorities before my car even reached the highway. The trap was sprung and the fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Connor did exactly what parasites do when the host organism dies. He panicked and he ran. When the reality of his impending federal exposure hit him, he completely abandoned ship. By dinner time that same evening, he had packed a single duffel bag with his most expensive tailored suits. He drained whatever meager funds were left in Jada's personal checking account, and he fled the state. He did not leave a letter. He did not say goodbye to the wife he claimed to love. He just vanished into the night, leaving my sister standing completely alone in the wreckage of their marriage. When federal agents arrived with a warrant the next morning, Jada was the only one home. The golden child who had spent her entire life shielded from consequences was suddenly dragged out of her designer lifestyle and thrown directly into an interrogation room. She was forced to face the terrifying reality of his massive debts, the furious investors, and the looming threat of federal accessory charges. Connor had left her holding the bag for his catastrophic financial crimes, and she did not have a single dime to hire a defense attorney. Meanwhile, back at the Buckhead estate, the 24-hour deadline expired. I watched the live security feed from my penthouse office as my private security team arrived at the property exactly at noon. Reginald and Vivian tried to stall. They tried to bargain with the guards, demanding more time to pack, but my instructions were absolute. They were escorted out the front door, carrying nothing but a few cardboard boxes filled with their personal clothing. They were forced to leave behind the imported rugs, the crystal chandeliers, and every single piece of luxury furniture they had used to project their fake wealth. They walked down the sweeping driveway on foot, completely stripped of their kingdom. In Atlanta, high society secrets are the most expensive currency, and my parents' bankruptcy was broadcast loud and clear. The eviction sent shockwaves through their elite circles. It was a spectacular, unmitigated collapse that no amount of PR spin could hide. By the end of the week, the country club board convened an emergency meeting. Following the exposure of Connor's embezzlement and my father's official sponsorship of his treasury seat, their membership was permanently and publicly revoked. They were formally banned from the premises. The humiliation did not stop there. The luxury vehicles parked outside the cheap motel they had temporarily booked were repossessed in broad daylight. Two massive tow trucks arrived and hooked up the Mercedes and the Range Rover, while their former country club friends undoubtedly watched and gossiped on group chats. The perfectly curated facade of black excellence that Reginald and Vivian had prioritized over their own family was absolutely incinerated. Within a month, the grand illusion of the Harrison family was completely dismantled. With no credit, no assets, and their reputations destroyed, they were forced to rent a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. It was a rundown building with peeling paint-thin walls and noisy neighbors. It was light years away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of Buckhead. The people who had once scoffed at a wheelchair scuffing their Brazilian hardwood floors were now living on cheap linoleum. They had to count pennies just to keep the lights on. Reginald, who had once strutted around in custom suits, now had to navigate public transportation to attend his bankruptcy hearings. Vivian, who had tossed my purse into a snowbank, had to carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator in their building was permanently broken. I reviewed the final asset transfer reports while sitting on the sunlit balcony of my penthouse sipping my morning coffee. I did not feel an ounce of pity for them. I felt a profound sense of justice. They were experiencing exactly the life they had tried to force upon my grandfather. They had locked us out in the freezing rain, and now they were left out in the cold permanently. The universe had simply balanced the scales, and I was the one who had tipped them. I transitioned my operations from the penthouse into a massive corporate headquarters in the financial district. I renamed the primary firm Harrison Holdings, cementing my grandfather's legacy in towering glass and steel. It was a fortress of legitimate wealth, guarded by top-tier security and functioning with absolute precision. 2 months into our new reality, the private line on my mahogany desk rang. It was Marcus, my head of building security. He sounded tense, carefully maintaining his professional tone, as he informed me there was a situation in the main lobby. A woman claiming to be my mother had bypassed the outer plaza and was currently causing a massive scene at the reception desk. She was crying hysterically and refusing to leave until she got what she called a second chance at family. I did not panic. I did not feel a sudden rush of anxiety. I simply instructed Marcus to hold her right there. I wanted to handle this personally. I stepped into my private elevator and took the descent down to the lobby. The polished metal doors slid open, revealing a massive atrium filled with natural light and echoing with the sound of desperate performative sobbing. Vivian was leaning heavily against the sleek marble reception desk. The sight of her was almost jarring. The haughty diamond-draped socialite who had sneered at my winter coat on Christmas Eve was completely gone. In her place stood a frantic, disheveled woman wearing a faded trench coat and scuffed shoes. Her natural hair, which she used to spend hundreds of dollars a week to keep perfectly straightened and styled, was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. The harsh reality of poverty had aged her a decade in a matter of weeks. When she heard my heels clicking against the marble floor, she spun around. Her eyes widened, and she immediately launched into her act. "Chloe," she wailed, her voice cracking as she stumbled toward me. "My beautiful daughter, please, you have to listen to me." She threw her arms open, lunging forward to pull me into a hug. I did not move a single muscle, but I did raise a commanding hand. Marcus and another security guard stepped instantly between us, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits. Vivian crashed into their extended arms, sobbing uncontrollably as they held her back. "Please, Chloe," she begged, tears streaming down her face and ruining what little drugstore makeup she had managed to apply. "I am so sorry. We are so incredibly sorry. You have to help us. We have nothing left." The new apartment is sweltering, and the landlord ignores our calls. Reginald is having severe chest pains from the stress of the bankruptcy hearings. Jada is facing federal indictment because of what Connor did, and the defense lawyers want retainers we absolutely cannot afford. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just leave us to die in the gutter. Please just give us a second chance at family. I stood safely behind my security detail and looked at the woman who had birthed me. I searched my heart for even a flicker of pity or a single drop of maternal connection. I dug deep, looking for the daughter who used to crave this woman's approval. I found absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest where a daughter's love should have resided was replaced by cold, hard steel. I looked at her desperate, tear-stained face, and all I saw was the freezing Atlanta snow. I felt the sharp, burning sting of Reginald's palm against my cheek. I heard the lock of the heavy oak door clicking shut as I stood shivering next to an 82-year-old man in a wheelchair. "You do not want a second chance at family, Vivian," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or compassion. "You want a second chance at my bank account. You do not miss your daughter. You miss your country club memberships. You miss your imported hardwood floors and your catered dinners. You miss the illusion of power." "No, Chloe, I swear," Vivian cried, shaking her head frantically. She reached her hands out through the gap between the security guards, grasping at the empty air between us. "We made a terrible mistake. We were blinded by financial stress and debt. I am your mother. I carried you. You have a good heart. Your grandfather knew you had a good heart. He would not want you to be this cruel to your own mother. Do not ever speak his name." I warned, my tone dropping to a dangerous razor-thin whisper that silenced her immediately. "You lost the right to speak his name the moment you tossed him into a blizzard to impress a criminal." I stepped out from behind the security guards, closing the physical distance between us. until I was standing right in front of her. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope that her guilt trip had somehow actually worked. She thought my proximity meant forgiveness. She thought the biological tether between a mother and daughter would save her from the consequences of her own horrific actions. I looked down at the woman who had tossed my purse into a snowbank. I looked at the very hands that had calmly passed a linen napkin to a violent man so he could wipe his palm after striking my face. I leaned in close, ensuring my words would carve themselves permanently into her memory. "Take this dead weight," I said, repeating the exact words she had sneered at me on Christmas Eve, "and do not ever come back." Vivian's jaw dropped. The breath hitched violently in her throat as the realization slammed into her chest. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. There was no mercy here. The bridge was not just burned. It had been pulverized into ash and scattered to the wind. I turned my attention to the head of security. "Marcus, escort this woman off my property immediately. If she or anyone else from her family steps foot within 100 yards of this building again, have them arrested for criminal trespassing." "Yes, Ms. Harrison," Marcus replied smoothly. He grabbed Vivian's arm firmly but professionally. She began to scream a wild, agonizing shriek of total defeat as the guards dragged her backward toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby. "Chloe, please, you cannot do this. We are your family, Chloe." Her wails echoed through the pristine corporate lobby, bouncing off the towering glass walls and dying in the vast open space. I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the private executive elevator. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. I did not turn around to watch her leave. I simply stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and watched the polished metal doors slide shut, completely silencing her cries forever. The quiet hum of the elevator ascending 60 floors felt like a physical separation from a past life. With every floor the car climbed, the memory of Vivian's desperate performative sobs faded further into nothingness. When the polished metal doors finally slid open, I did not step out into a battlefield. I stepped into a sanctuary. The executive suite of Harrison Holdings was bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. It was silent, secure, and entirely mine. Julian Sterling was waiting for me near the expansive glass wall that opened onto the private wrap-around balcony. He held a thick leather-bound portfolio. Unlike the folders that had dismantled my parents' fraudulent lives, this one was not a weapon. It was a shield. I walked past the massive mahogany desk and pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the warm Atlanta air. The city sprawled out below me, a vast grid of concrete and glass, totally unaware of the empire operating above the clouds. Julian followed me out, presenting the portfolio and a solid gold fountain pen. The documents inside required my final signature to officially establish the Jeremiah Harrison Foundation. We were launching with an initial endowment of $50 million. The mission was incredibly specific and ruthlessly executed. The foundation would provide elite pro bono legal representation for elderly individuals facing predatory incompetency motions from their own families. It would fund private secure housing for vulnerable seniors and employ forensic auditors to track down and prosecute relatives attempting to siphon retirement funds or life insurance policies. I was building a massive, impenetrable wall to ensure that no senior citizen would ever face the terror of being shoved out of their own home on a freezing winter night by the very people they raised. I took the pen from Julian. I smoothed the thick parchment paper against the balcony railing. I signed my name with firm, deliberate strokes. Chloe Harrison. I handed the portfolio back to Julian. He gave me a respectful nod, completely understanding the gravity of the moment, and quietly retreated back into the office, leaving me alone with the skyline. I rested my hands on the cool metal of the balcony railing and looked down at the streets below. 6 months ago, I was bleeding in the snow, pushing a wheelchair through the freezing sleet, convinced that my entire world had been destroyed. I had believed that being discarded by my parents was the ultimate failure. I had spent 35 years trying to audit my own personality, trying to balance a family ledger that was rigged against me from the start. Reginald and Vivian demanded perfection, but actively punished independence. Jada demanded the spotlight, while contributing absolutely nothing to the actual labor of maintaining it. They were a collective black hole draining energy, capital, and sanity from anyone foolish enough to stand too close. But as I stood at the pinnacle of the empire, my grandfather built the absolute truth settled into my bones. I did not just inherit a logistical monopoly. I did not just inherit 9 commercial skyscrapers, international stock portfolios, and $1.8 billion in liquid assets. I inherited my freedom. The money is simply a tool. It is the armor that ensures I will never have to shrink myself to fit inside someone else's fragile ego ever again. It is the power to look a bully directly in the eye and dismantle their entire existence with a single signature. But the real inheritance was the lesson Grandpa Jeremiah imparted in that dingy highway motel room. He taught me the most valuable currency in the human experience. Blood does not make you family. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It is an accident of genetics. Reginald shared my blood and he slapped me across the face to impress a thief. Vivian shared my blood and she tossed my only means of survival into a snowbank. Jada shared my blood and she gleefully plotted to declare our grandfather mentally incompetent to pay for a party. Loyalty is what makes you family. Trust is what makes you family. The willingness to stand between the people you love and the storm trying to consume them, that is the only metric that actually matters. Grandpa Jeremiah had the capital to buy his way out of that freezing night instantly. He could have summoned a fleet of black cars the second Reginald grabbed his wheelchair, but he chose to endure the cold to see who would stand beside him. I stood beside him when I thought we had $30 left to our name. That is why I am standing on this balcony today. I took one last deep breath of the warm southern air. The sun dipped lower, catching the reflective glass of the surrounding towers. I turned away from the edge and walked back inside. The heavy balcony doors sealed shut behind me, locking out the noise of the city. I strode past the reception area and walked directly into the center of my massive silent boardroom. I took my seat at the head of the polished marble table. I opened my encrypted laptop, ready to review the latest global market audits. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the punchline to a cruel family joke. I am a billionaire. I am a protector of the vulnerable. And I am a woman who will never ever be silenced again. The most profound lesson from this story is that blood does not automatically define family. Loyalty, respect, and unconditional support do. Society often pressures us to endure toxic behavior simply because we share DNA with our abusers. However, this narrative emphasizes the vital importance of setting ironclad boundaries to protect our peace and dignity. True wealth is never measured by country club memberships, luxury cars, or a curated social image, but by the integrity of our character during the darkest moments. Walking away from those who constantly diminish your worth is not a betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. If you have ever found the courage to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your peace, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your own empowering journey in the comments below.